awukholana buso wami awukholana ilondoloze zuhambe nami Jerusalema ikhaya lami ilondoloze uhambe nami zungangishilana Jerusalema ikhaya lami ilondoloze uhambe nami zungangishilana dawo yami ayikholana buso wami awukholana ilondoloze zuhambe nami
Good evening and welcome. I'm going to provide Spanish interpretation instructions for the ones that want to join the line, the Spanish line. Buenas noches y bienvenidos. Espero que se encuentren bien. Es un gusto tenerlos con nosotros. Para escuchar este evento en el idioma español, por favor llamen al número de teléfono 844-857-5555. Voy a repetir el número de teléfono. 844-857-5555. Una vez que ingresen a la línea de interpretación, por favor marquen el código de acceso. El código de acceso es 811-7900. 811-7900. Al final de ingresar el código, por favor, también tienen que ingresar la estrella o el numeral. Gracias y que disfruten esta noche.
Welcome. To access closed captioning, please click on the icon on the bottom right hand of your Zoom screen that says CC/live transcript. Again, to access closed captioning, please click on the icon on the bottom right hand of your Zoom screen that says CC/live transcript. We also have Spanish and ASL interpretation. Accessibility is a huge part of the work that we want to do. And so we want to make sure these spaces are accessible and safe for everyone. And with that, I just want to take a moment to recognize what has transpired today in the news with the release of someone who has caused great harm to so many women. Oftentimes in this movement, we find ourselves fighting a fight that seems as though it will never end or it will never get better. We continue to put our stories out there, displaying these traumatic experiences only for our feelings to be disregarded. We continue to put our stories out there, displaying these traumatic experiences only for us to be disappointed. We are called brave, strong, as if those are badges of honor. But all we want is to have a world free of violence, a world committed to dismantling rape culture. This is not a miscarriage of justice being corrected. This is a continued display of survivors of sexual violence being disregarded. So tonight, as a survivor myself, I want to send love to all survivors of sexual violence and advocates who do this work. And with that, we welcome you to our final webinar. It is good to be back with you all to close out the Survivor Healing Series, Disruptors Edition, with yet another beautiful conversation. We are so honored to have been in community with you all and look forward to the brave spaces we will co-create together. As survivors and survivor advocates, we want you to know that the work to end sexual violence is a daily commitment, and this series serves as one of the reminders of many ways we can step up to disrupt. We have talked about the role of therapy and mental health in disrupting rape culture, unpacking familiar trauma and moving through healing, and disrupting rape culture amongst youth. And tonight, we will learn more about the international movement to end sexual violence. This space is a weekly gathering for us to come to ourselves and learn strategies to help us heal in our journey and stepping up and being disruptors. My name is Venkayla Haynes, and I'm your host and moderator. I'm a survivor, organizer, and advocate who has been fighting against sexual violence for the last 8 years, with a direct focus on HBCU students and K-12 schools in low-income areas. As someone who has experienced harm, I'm committed to dismantling rape culture, to make sure survivors, especially marginalized folks, have access to the resources and support that they need. I work with a host of local and national organizations dedicated to eradicating sexual violence and fighting against harmful legislation as well. Anytime I do this work, I think about my why. And my why is to always make sure that there is never another Black girl like me who has had the same experiences, goes without the resources and support that she needs. Tonight is an opportunity for us to have some real talk. And when I say real, I mean open, honest, and transparent. It is our brave space to learn how to disrupt rape culture and show up for survivors in our lives. Get real about how hard it can be to do so, because this journey is hard. And learn new tools so we can build toward our freedom dreams. Tonight, you might feel inspired and empowered after our discussion. You might also feel anger, fear, guilt, and shame. All of that is accepted here because all of that is valid. You deserve this space to be in your journey, whatever it looks like to you. If you feel triggered or otherwise feel the need to step away, we encourage you to take care of yourself. This session will be recorded and available on Me Too's Facebook and YouTube page. It will be here when you are ready to come back to it. Now, without further ado, I'd like to invite Shashina Bray to lead us in a grounding exercise. Shashina is Me Too's Director of Programs and is a mother, therapist, activist, and educator. As we have built our understanding of and capacity as disruptors each week, we have also shared healing practices, tools, and exercises to add to our toolkit. These grounding exercises we have done together are important to come back to center and to be in the present. And Shashina is going to lead us through a practice we can access at any time to connect to the earth and to remember that we are held. Shashina, take it away.
Thank you, Venkayla. Peace and good evening to everyone. I'm always grateful to have this opportunity to be in community with you. If you joined us for our first week of the series, when we talked about grounding, we defined it as a practice that supported us in relaxing, supporting us in coming back to ourselves, helping us to get out of that worry place and access more calm and relaxation in the body. In addition to that definition of grounding, there's also the definition of grounding that refers to earthing, the intentional connection with earth in order to reap the electrical magnetic benefits of the earth. Think about ourselves as batteries and the earth being our power source. And so when we place our hands into the earth, place our feet into the earth, place our bodies against the earth, when we slow down to do that, we get to reap the benefits of the earth. We get to charge back up. In addition, we allow ourselves to be held. And so today I invite you to ground with me. Perhaps you'd like to get something natural to support you in our practice today. Perhaps a stone or a crystal. I'm sitting near my corn plant today. Perhaps you have a plant you have that you'd like to incorporate. Perhaps it's connecting with your wood floors around you, or perhaps you can even go outside. But I'll give you a moment, 1 minute, to gather what you might need as we prepare to ground and reap the benefits of earth. As we wait for people to gather what they might need, just invite you to begin to drop into your breath. Begin to notice your body's natural pace of breathing. Perhaps you like to do a stretch the shoulders of the neck to support you into settling into stillness for a few moments. Start to listen to your body. Beautiful. So placing whatever natural element you have near your body, in your hand, I invite you to close your eyes if that feels comfortable for you, or perhaps lower your gaze. Try to pull back through the ears so that your head is really resting over your shoulders. Your shoulders are relaxed. As you sit up long and tall, noticing your breath. Notice your natural pace of breathing. Notice the movement and the stillness as you connect with Earth. Imagine yourself like a tree deeply rooted, solid, stable, unshakable. Imagine sending your roots down through your sits bones or down through your feet, down into the earth, deep, 100,000 feet. And on your exhale, see yourself pulling up that energy from 100,000 feet. Inhale, send your energy into the earth. Exhale, receive it. Inhale, send your energy deep into the earth. Exhale, allow yourself to be held here. Allow yourself to be held. That your size doesn't matter. Your problems don't matter. You're not too much to handle. You can be held here. And we'll close as we usually do with 3 collective breaths together. Breathing in through the nose, filling up in our diaphragm. We exhale and soften. Inhale, fill up. Exhale and soften. Taking the deepest breath you've taken all day. Inhale, fill up. And exhale and soften. Before you begin to move, I invite you just to take a moment to notice the effects of the practice. Notice what it's like to slow down, make contact, and charge up. This practice and all the other practices will be sent to you via email and available in the chat. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you for leading us in that practice, Shashina. I hope that helped you all in arriving in this moment. For this series, we have been co-creating and holding a brave space together. And that means each of us taking responsibility for the health and well-being of the collective. As a reminder, our community agreements are as follows. 1, respect the space. 2, no judgment zone. Every step you take towards your healing is an act of courage. As our panelists share their wisdom and stories, let us approach the conversation with curiosity and compassion for them, for ourselves, and for each other. 3, lean into curiosity. Tonight, the chat box is open for asking questions and being in community with each other. We ask that you connect with each other, affirm what is being said, and seek out resources to support your healing journeys. 4, ask for support. We have expert healing specialists moderating the chat. Please reach out to them if you would like support in finding healing resources in your community. Please leave it to them to answer any concerns or requests for resources that are raised in the chat. They are there so that you can focus on being present with the conversation and with one another. As for our resources, tonight we encourage you to take care of yourself. If you feel triggered or need to otherwise step away, please do so. We will not get offended if you need to step away from the computer. Turn the volume down. Self-care is important and self-care is a priority. We have a virtual healing room that you find on Facebook and in the Zoom chat. By clicking on different images, you will be transported to various resources and activities. You can also go to metoomovement.org. Movement is spelled MVMT to access the Library of Healing Resources. Again, metoomovement.org. Movement is spelled MVMT to access the Library of Healing Resources. And let's get into it. Tonight's conversation brings together experts from across the global movement to dialogue about the nuances of disrupting sexual violence on an international scale. We will collectively lean about the interventions and innovation happening across the world and consider each of our roles in the fight to end sexual violence across the globe. We are joined by Thokozani Ndaba, founder and executive director of the Ntethelelo Foundation, a nonprofit organization that uses applied drama, theater techniques, and visual arts as tools for social and behavior change and healing and personal growth in Johannesburg. As a theater practitioner, human rights activist, and facilitator, Ndaba's work comprises of activism, education, and research. We are also joined by Celeste Faison, Special Projects and Global Initiative Consultant at Me Too International, who is a strategist with 20 years of experience as an organizer, trainer, and movement architect. At Me Too International, she spearheads special projects and global initiatives, which includes constructing their US and global networks and leading political work. And lastly, Lisa Block, Program Officer at Freedom from Violence at Global Fund for Women, a foundation dedicated to supporting bold ambition and expansive gender justice movements. She previously worked for the International Institute of the Bay Area, where she created a community dance program for adolescent girls that has worked for Toastin in Senegal, a non-government organization. Thank you all for joining this space, and let's welcome our panelists into the conversation. So let's get right into it. I would love for us to get started by having you each introduce yourself and share your why. What grounds you in the work to disrupt and ultimately end sexual violence? Celeste, we can start with you.
Okay, great. Hey everyone, peace. My name is Celeste and my pronouns are she and her. I hail from New York City and have the privilege of living in the neighborhood in which I was born and raised, Harlem, which is not that easy to do these days. But we still here. What grounds me in the work of the work to end sexual violence is, well, one is my own journey, right? As a survivor, and my journey, and the trajectory of that journey, still being in motion, and knowing that as it's been a lifelong journey for me as a victim of childhood sexual violence, that it's a lifelong journey to end sexual violence, and wanting overall. And so wanting to be a part of that, to stop it and both as a vehicle towards my own healing, is why I'm here. And I'll pass it to Lisa.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa, and I go by the she, her pronouns. I feel really honored to have been invited into this space with Me Too and the Ntethelelo Foundation. The why of the work for me is really how fundamental freedom from violence is to all of our basic rights. We know that all of our rights are interconnected, the social, political, and economic, and can't have one without the other. And yet freedom from violence is fundamental before we can really experience our other basic rights. You know, until we're able to control our bodies and feel safe, we can't thrive as individuals and as a society. And so for me, being somehow a part of the work and contributing is, as Celeste said, also very personally healing and inspiring. I am just inspired every day by the women, girls, and trans and queer folks that Global Fund, the activists and human rights defenders that Global Fund for Women supports. And learning, despite the challenges, learning about how they define what justice means to them and playing some role in supporting their journey towards justice brings me joy and inspiration. Thank you. I'll pass it to Thokozani.
You're on mute, Thokozani.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. It's such a pleasure and honor for me to be here and be part of this conversation. I'm really grateful for the opportunity. And as a survivor and in my healing journey, I'm just really grateful to be here with other healers and people who actually understand or who do this work and know what it feels like to be living every day and trying to pull yourself out of that hole. So it takes me to the why I do this work. I do this work because it heals me. I draw from my own pain as a survivor. And yeah, I know how important it is as a young woman to have someone that you can talk to, somebody that believes you, and a place where you can go feel safe and share your experiences of what has happened to you. Because most of the time, as women, we realize that it happens a lot that you're judged, or young women are judged to say, what were you doing there? Or why were you drunk? Or what were you doing out at that time? Me being wherever doesn't mean that I need to get raped or, so this work, as I said earlier, heals me, and it builds me and it gives me courage to face the world, and I'm able to bring healings, finding different ways of bringing healings to individuals and communities, and that I work in.
Yeah, I think for a lot of us who do work in this movement, we come from it from a space of being survivors, in a space of redefining what justice is, in a space of wanting a better world, a safer world. And so with that, we know that the global movement to end sexual violence requires all of us to work from multiple vantage points and in various capacities and spaces. Can you all tell us more about your particular approach and intervention to disrupt rape culture and ultimately end sexual violence? So what is your approach to dismantling violence in this movement?
Well, I can go.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I could say that I just try and find different ways of like bringing healing to this work because when you gather, more especially with the women that I work with and the young women, everybody's bringing different pain and different experiences. But how do you find ways of collective healing together that now we are in that space? So I use a lot of applied theater. I borrow from different things and applied theater. So with the main focus on the theater of the oppressed, which is used widely in my communities and different communities where I come from, where the people will gather around a tree or around a circle to talk about what had happened, whatever issues that had happened. So why I use theater? Because theater is it helps communities to process those issues without facing them directly. You're able to take them to fantasy and back into reality at the same time. So while you bring, there's a conflict in a community, and I bring in one of the theater of the oppressed techniques, which is forum theater, which is what they know in the community, because it's gathering around and having somebody facilitating, but at the same time, it raises awareness, it heightens the issues, and it brings change and healing. So applied theater is to transform and bring change and healing within communities. So yes, like I said, I use different theater techniques and trauma processes to eliminate this pandemic that we face of gender-based violence and also sexual violence that happens. And yeah, I found theater as one of the powerful tools, like I said, for me, because it also teaches us and teaches us to teach people, and it's inclusive, and it's easier for people to engage than facing the matters directly. So it makes it easier for uncomfortable conversations to happen through a technique or a drama process.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because we know that activism looks different for everyone. Organizing work looks different. And we know that art is a form of activism and a form of organizing. So I think applied theater and using different performance technique can definitely be a pivotal moment for healing. But I wanted to ask you, since healing looks different for everyone, and it's not one size fits all for healing and resources, how do you go about navigating that space of using your art and the things that you do to work with survivors directly?
For example, what I can pick on is when we have different rape cases where you find that the survivor was violated by some individual who is somebody of importance, and when it comes to court, you find that the docket and the case is delayed and it gets postponed maybe 10 times. I'll think of one case where we had case that was postponed so many times, and I brought in my art where I performed as Lady Justice outside the High Court, where we put in pressure to the court, where we draw attention, but also in working in the space with the survivors is allowing them to share their own stories, and starting point being the focal point of forgiveness and forgiving of self, which is common to all of us because we blame ourselves, like I said earlier, for being there, for wearing certain clothes, or for whatever reason. So if I'm able to forgive myself, which is the name of the foundation, meaning Ntethelelo, meaning forgiveness. So when we start by forgiving ourselves, we're able to start the process of healing, because then we stop blaming ourselves and we seek healing to say that, you know, I know that the people who have harmed me, they won't come, maybe never ever come and ask for forgiveness, but how am I able to crack that healing process? So it becomes easier for us and survivors together, and we're able to share and from our life experience and draw from that, starting with forgiveness, and yeah, that assist in looking at what actions and to take, and yeah, around healing and yeah, making change and the difference, and still continue the fight while we healing ourselves, which is hard for any Black women in the
Right.
world. Looking at where we are, always in the bottom of the ladder, but we continue the fight. So I think the collectiveness also of healing, when you bring in survivors together, or just women who are affected by different, like Lisa said earlier, that we're facing different kinds of oppression. So when we come together, we're fighting the same struggle because all oppression is connected. So yeah, thank you.
That's definitely right. Always making sure that your work is survivor focused and resource focused. Lisha, would you like to share any approaches that you would take to dismantle rape culture?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, did you say Lisa or Celeste?
Lisa.
Okay. I can just share, so Global Fund for Women is a feminist fund, and I can share a little bit about our approach as a funder, and then later I'll have a chance to share about our partners on the ground. We provide resources to feminist and women's rights organizations and movements. And our goal is to provide them with the resources that they need to build grassroots people power and transform the systems that perpetuate injustice and violence. And a lot of the movements that we are supporting are fighting against sexual and gender-based violence. And the organizations and movements that we support are primarily in the global South, and they're led by women, girls, trans, intersex, and gender diverse people from those communities who are a part of broader gender justice movements. And our understanding of gender justice is intersectional. As Thokozani was just talking about, I mean, you really can't have gender justice without racial justice. And
Right.
similarly, the way the feminist and the women's rights groups that we support on the ground are addressing sexual and gender-based violence is also intersectional. That intersectionality is really a big part of our work because the communities they serve are facing multiple layers of violence due to patriarchy, misogyny, and different parts and aspects of their identity, such as race and caste and ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability, and on and on. That so really the fight against SGBV, sexual and gender-based violence, is also the fight against racism and all the other isms and phobias. And one other really important part of our strategy is that we prioritize funding to groups that are led by those who are most impacted by marginalization and the different layers of systemic violence. And as a feminist funder, we really trust that those who are most impacted by violence and experiencing marginalization, they know what they need for their healing and for justice, and they're best placed to find the solutions. So we provide really flexible funding and core support so that they're able to set their agendas and determine how they use our funds.
What kind of progress or changes have you seen when it comes to funding different projects?
What kind of progress have I seen?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's so many different examples I could use. I think one that's relevant to what we've been talking about in terms of healing and what justice means would be an example of our funding of our partners in Sri Lanka. One of our partners did a study with for survivors who had experienced sexual violence during the almost 30-year civil war there, to really understand what does reparations mean and what does justice mean for them. And so in some cases, the survivors of violence mentioned financial resources and so that they could regenerate, regain dignity, restart their lives. And in other cases, they mentioned other things, such as a statue honoring the survivors and really acknowledging the past. And in other instances, it was really the desire to have an apology and an acknowledgement of the wrongdoing. And so for me, that was really meaningful to learn from them what justice could mean. But beyond that, the progress that beyond it being healing in itself, to think about what justice means for survivors, our partner then used some of our funding to talk with the Office of Reparations and really influence them and share what survivor-centered reparations mean and how they can safely access those reparations.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, because that's something that we've been talking about for, I think, all of the last three series that we've had. What does justice look like for survivors? And when we talked about justice, what does justice look like outside of prisons, in jails? And how do we make sure that these movements are survivor centered? So my next question is, what challenges and opportunities exist when navigating sexual violence with survivors and advocates in various parts of the world? And Celeste, we can start with you, and also touching on the point of what does collaboration look like when it comes to these challenges and opportunities?
Yeah, so I can talk a bit about it. So when one of the projects that the Me Too movement as an organization is working on is building our global network. So when Me Too went viral, all of these movements around the world, whose lineage goes way before Me Too, right? So like we have to talk about like the lineage of movements to end sexual violence have been hundreds of years, right? And that Me Too was a movement within this lineage. And so when it went viral, Me Too as a calling card was able to resonate with so many different folks who've been working, who fall within that lineage to end sexual violence. And at the same time, it inspired new people who around the world to start organizing around sexual violence. So there's a really sweet spot there of like these tried and true methods and this innovation. And one of the things that we wanted to answer was, well, how do all of those people come together, right? How do we form community with each other? And how are we resources to each other so that we can identify what are the common challenges, what are the successful models of organizing, what are the narratives, the stories, and the language that we collectively share that works, and then how do we uplift each other's work to build power, collective power. And so that's really what we've been working on. And so part of that is, as to not be prescriptive, we've been interviewing, I think we've interviewed 10 organizations, and we had about almost 500 formations fill out this global survey to learn about what some of the challenges were. And it ranges, right? So the first big challenges we have to say is patriarchy. And the second is white supremacy, right? So we have to name those the structural things that anyone who lives an intersectional life, meaning a life where you have multiple issues on top of each other. For instance, I'm Black, I'm a woman, I'm a big Black woman, all of that, right? So that's one of the challenges. Some of the other challenges that we've that were really interesting is that folks are organizing in environments that are not just hostile around sexual violence, but around being a woman itself, right? So we got to hear some of the challenges of this group in Nigeria that is organizing around sexual violence in communities that have been taken over by Boko Haram, who are really like, have a very old way of thinking about women and don't want women to have education or anything of that such. And so they're organizing on both of those fronts at the same time. And again, that's the intersectional. You have folks in India who lead the Dalit movement, where women can be assigned rape as a sentence or be forced to marry their rapists so that they can be deemed clean again, right? And so you have like laws that facilitate and perpetuate that. And then you have like really interesting case studies in Australia of Indigenous women who are organizing around body sovereignty as a means to bring to end sexual violence and to have a conversation about sovereignty as an Indigenous people in their native land, which has been taken over, right, by hundreds of years of colonization. And so I think some of the biggest challenges here is that we don't live single issue lives. It's multi-issues, right. And often groups, the groups that we've interviewed are organizing around a number of things at the same time. And so how does that get managed and held and done, and what are the implications of that? And how do you ever experience a win, right? Or feel like you've reached a point when the oppression is ongoing?
Yeah, I think that's very important to name, especially when you said we don't live single issue lives, because my follow-up question is, how do we change that narrative? Because when a lot of people think of Me Too, of course they think of it being started by a Black woman, Tarana Bird, but they also think of it being whitewashed oftentimes. So how do we change that narrative to talk about the issues that are happening outside the United States, to center trans folks, to center queer folks, to center non-binary folks, to center Black women? How do we change that narrative when we know what the media shows as the movement?
Mm-hmm. So I think we're still figuring that out, right? So we don't have the answer, but this is what we do have,
Absolutely.
Right? One, we have a commitment to Black feminism, right? And to organize within a Black feminism lens and to be creating communities under that guise, which is not prescriptive, right? It's like, what does that mean? And what does it mean for your culture, for your country, for your context, right? So that we're not just assuming what people's values are. And how do we have a community process to figure that out? And then the other thing I would offer is I've been to a lot of countries in South Africa and in Senegal. Feminism is like tied into the activism, right? It's built into the fabric in a way that's different in the United States context. Often you learn that as an after. It's a specialty to get that information, right? But these women are able to articulate that, and I think have really good models that can teach folks in the United States and in other countries about how they shift that narrative and begin to organize with that as the starting place. We have a lot of work to do, but I think if we create spaces for these conversations to happen, we can conjure something beautiful.
Absolutely. Lisa or Thokozani, do you all have anything to add? Any challenges or opportunities exist when navigating this space?
Yeah, I just want to talk about, the work that we do in the foundation. It's about helping survivors or women build resilience and also to help them find their own voices. But then when you're doing that kind of work, the challenge becomes, the institutions such as culture and religion, because a lot of cultural practices are very oppressive to women. Doesn't matter whether you're a woman in India or you're a woman in the other part in Venezuela, like every cultural practice, we know how oppressive it can be to women. Here we have like practices like Ogutwala, forced marriages. We're still having issues of FGMs in Africa. We're still like having like women have to go through arranged marriage. Sometimes when they're forced to marry, parents are not even involved. But like I think Celeste mentioned patriarchy, that patriarchy rules and it rules the world. And all these cultural practices and they oppress women so much that within your household, you find that they're training you to go nurture somebody and to be somebody's wife. You never taught who you are or self-love or self-respect or anything about self. And you find that most the young women I work with, they felt so discriminated against because of age. They cannot express themselves. They cannot go to health facilities because of how culture sees it, that you're too young to be coming for contraceptive or having an abortion. You cannot bring your parents. So we use a lot of theater in talking about the challenges that women and young women face when they try and seek help or just any form of service as a woman. It's just like, it's so heavy, it's so hard. And also in our country, the government is just struggling with giving us basic human rights. Imagine our right as women. It's like the killings of women happens here. Like, we are the rape capital of the country, as we call it. Doesn't mean that our government cares and nobody cares about it. But so if you think that religion is supposed to be nourishing our souls and spiritual growth, and for us to be able and fuel us to do this work and bring change into the world and collectively make a difference, but you find that religion actually perpetuates a division that happens in the world. Like we've seen it in different parts of the world, what's happening with Israel and Palestine, what happens all over. So here, religion is still used as a tool to oppress, whether it's agreeing to say that, well, you have to be killed and raped because you are lesbian and it's against God and religion. Well, you have to be beaten up or killed as a trans woman because you don't qualify to be a woman. It's a lot of things that culture and religion perpetuate and fuels this kind of issues that we face. Like right now, we've had this notion that men, where they can sleep with babies just because they believe that it can cure HIV, and it's gone across and it's been a problem. And how religion actually is the biggest challenge, like I said, in cultural practices, because it takes our work backwards all the time, because we seek the spiritual growth and then we want to go and find it within the religion. And other people find it in different places. But what I'm talking about religion specifically, it's because it forces the oppression of women when it says that women come from a man's rib. And it's very challenging because we started working with young men, because the young men felt that they go back into the street and the young men they deal with, they're the same men, that they're older, that they're fathers, that are doing the same thing. So how can you change that? Then we started a group of young men. But how they believe that really it's like drained into their minds and their heads, that actually because you're a boy, you don't have to do any chores. And also because you're a boy, you are the head of the house, because women come from your rib, where we have now that has resulted into these young men or older men raping their own grandmothers because they are not told the truth that you actually need to respect the vagina from a young age because that's where you come from. But then religion and patriarchy culture comes in and just kind of like rub everything that we've done. And when it comes to women and their sexual rights and reproductive health, it's not even a talk that you find that it's encouraged even in schools or even in the curriculum. No way. So we find ourselves continuing this fight that women gathered in Beijing in 1995 and talk about all these rights and equality and sexual right and whatever, but it's 2021. We feel like we're not even near close to that. Instead, we're moving backwards because of these institutions that are taking us backward. You know, and like I want to talk more also on women in Africa and other corners of the world that, you know, there have been a lot of organizing, like Celeste said earlier, it's been continuing and it's still continuing even now in different pockets of the world. Like we can see, we saw the uprising that happened in Egypt and Palestine, everywhere. Here, women have been in the forefront, but the patriarchy also still make men being the leaders. When you talk about politics or change that has been brought, more especially here, they'll talk about the male leaders and forgetting all the women who suffered through a lot of other issues just because there were women in prison at the time and they couldn't get whether sanitary towels or whatever they need, or not knowing if your children have been raped or they're still there. So all those sufferings, they don't matter because the male figure is still in charge. So yeah, it becomes a big challenge, but yeah, we continue to use theater to affect change, and starting with the behavior, like I said, for me, it's about assisting, finding healing with individuals so we can see behavior that can affect the whole community. And the challenges are not stopping us, we're moving forward, but it becomes so hard as a Black woman who do this work. And you damage emotionally and mentally because what you work under, the environment and the neglect and the level of poverty and the rape that happens, and it breaks you. But for you, you question yourself that when people talk about self-care and taking care of yourself or healing, what does it mean for Black women like me who work in such environments where there couldn't be any water, there's no water or any running thing, but you still have to deal with these issues. And when then do you place, or where do you place yourself? And when do you then are able enough to have enough, whether it's funds for you to have therapy, to be able to assist, because we know you have to fill your own cup before you can fill anybody else's cup.
Absolutely.
And I just wanted to say, V, sorry, that I'm so grateful that Lisa is here and she's saying all these things about Global Fund, but you know, what I know about Global Fund, that yes, they do assist in bringing change, but what they look at, they're not, for us on the grassroots, like when you think of applying for Global Fund, you think like, where I work, there's no internet, there's no whatever, and writing those documents, how do I even get to qualify to get that access to that funding, or even have enough electricity to last before I can send that email? And then they will look at giving funds to the main recipients, to establish organizations that already have funding, and then you come in as a sub-recipient, which my organization has never been or gotten any funds besides AIDS Head Foundation help. So it becomes very, very difficult. And then you like, but we are there doing the work on the ground, and just because we don't have resources and we have volunteers who cannot even get there because of where they come from, but the big institutions are the ones that getting the funds because they have everything in order. But how do we get in order if we're not seen, if we're not given a platform and a space? That's why I'm grateful to the Me Too movement that they're going in all pockets of the world to look at the people who are right there, who are doing this work, to say that we're pulling you out and we are with you, and together we can make a difference. Yes, like I said, we know that Global Fund does change, but sometimes with the main issues with the funders, they give you funding, but they tell you what to do with that funding. But you're like, but the issues that this community face or this parts of the world face is this. But no, we're saying that we're looking at women's issues or whatever, but we're like, but lesbian and trans women are the most vulnerable groups right now and at risk in this country because it's allowed, because they use culture and religion to enforce those things. But yeah, so I like to find ways also of us while we're doing this fight in addressing those issues and looking at how we can talk to such challenges that face.
Yeah, I love that you raised that point, because that's why it's so important to center marginalized communities and listen to organizers that are on the ground doing this work, because we know what's best for our communities because we're in those communities. So making sure that it's important, it's a priority that you're listening to us when we tell you what issues are important, what we need the funds for, and what needs to be done on the ground, because we know our communities the best. So definitely important that you raise that point of making sure that funders, whoever it is, understands that why it's important to listen to grassroots organizers on the ground who are dedicated to these communities, going into these communities, speaking to these people, and doing this work.
I just wanted to perhaps respond to the question, but also just respond to Thokozani, and thank you for bringing that up. I think that definitely, as a feminist funder, one of our missions is influencing philanthropy, because all the things that you're talking about are very real. And on our end, we have about 3,000 advisors around the world that are feminist activists within their communities that help connect us to grassroots emerging groups. And we provide core support grants, which means they're not for projects, they're for what the organization set as their priority, and whether it be organizational development, paying salaries, things that a lot of times a lot of funders want essential, or self and collective care for the staff, and part of our work is influencing our donors and other philanthropy to understand that need. And the digital divide is real, and we're challenged because we want to reach groups all over the world, and there is a digital divide. People have internet cutouts; they don't have the money to pay for the internet connection, and so we try to really work with, like for example, we are funding groups in conflict areas, and we're providing internet to one of our partners in Sudan to be able to help grassroots in those areas be able to access our online proposal. And sometimes we will call groups on the phone so that they can submit their report over the phone. Really important to think about, how we could be inclusive and don't create that divide. I was just gonna sort of also share about, as Celeste was saying, the layers of violence, and that being such a challenge. We are working to support the feminist, Palestine feminist anti-violence movement. And a lot of our partners have been talking about the layers of violence that Palestinian women and girls and gender diverse and gender non-conforming people face. Everything from the Israeli military occupation to settler colonialism to patriarchy in their own communities. And that's what we see a lot with the women's organizations that we face. As Celeste was saying, you know, there are Indigenous women who are part of the larger Indigenous movement protecting their land, and then they're facing sexual violence and patriarchy within their own communities. Another thing that in Palestine that our partners face are there's additional barriers that they've shared with us about reporting violence that's perpetrated against them by Palestinian men, because sometimes they know that if they report them, then they will be dealt with by the Israeli police. And so they feel like that's an additional, like they're betraying the Palestinian cause by reporting violence that's being perpetrated against them. A lot of the women and girls are sometimes killed because they've been perceived to dishonor the family. You might have heard this referred to as honor killing, but in the feminist movement, we don't refer to it as honor killing, we refer to it as femicide, because we know it has nothing to do with honor and really everything to do with controlling women and their bodies. Because the legal system is another challenge that the movement to address sexual and gender-based violence faces, because due to outdated and discriminatory laws, a lot of times the perpetrators of femicide are able to walk free. But we have seen in terms of like collaboration and bringing in the positive, we have seen in 2019, there was a case of femicide, and the woman was killed by her family, and it led to public outrage. And Palestinians across the region were marching under the banner, "No liberated homeland without the liberation of women." And I thought that was just a really powerful way of connecting the struggles, because they are interconnected. And Global Fund for Women has really been this past year embarking on a learning journey of how we can more deeply support the movement, the Palestinian feminist anti-violence movement. And so we supported Palestinian feminists to conduct a landscape analysis to understand the movement ecosystem. You know, who are the individual activists and organizations and collectives that make up the movement. And now we're exchanging to see how we'd be able to provide resources directly to the movement, potentially through a movement committee or a feminist collective that's made up of different actors within the movement, so that we can really support more their collective decision-making about what the needs are, what success means for their movement, and even how to allocate those resources. Something
that was also a little bit, you answered a little bit of my follow-up question. What have you all learned directly from funding these survivor-led movements on the ground, outside from what needs to be done in the future, and learning about what they can do in their communities? What have you all learned directly about these movements and about the different issues that are impacting these communities?
Can I go? What I could talk about, my experience is that it's so hard because most of the organizations are relying on donor funding, on donors. So when the donor pull out the funding, the organization collapses because, like I said, our government is not even able to assist with basic human right needs of water or whatever. There's a lot of corruption and stealing and all other things that are happening. So that has been the problem. And also conflict resolution. There is, it's so painful to get discriminated within women groups, or human rights groups, or whatever groups that fight for all these injustices just because you're trans women or you're lesbian women, or sometimes we know most of these spaces or feminist spaces are owned by white women, and there's always that. But we find that then you find that also within the movement itself, like I was saying, the gaps, instead of us coming together, but we all know that patriarchy has always come in between to divide women. So the collectiveness of coming together and being strong in building the movement and not letting patriarchy or the lack of funds from donors, but just pushing, because we know that when I'm standing here, I'm standing for that woman in Mexico or in Palestine that is suffering the same suffering, but in different parts of the world. How do we collectively come together? So it's what we've seen here. And I think organizations and movements have been forming like groups. So you find that there's a WhatsApp group or human rights groups, and it's have all these kind of other organizations or small NPOs and are part of it, and we talk about issues, and then they'll talk about the new policy or a new bill that needs to be changed, and what do we do? So that, and also with COVID not being able to gather and stuff like that, so those platforms have been helpful, and obviously like Zoom, but I think that's all I could say for now. I don't know.
So I know throughout this conversation, we've been talking a lot about patriarchy, and we know that is a part of an oppressive system. So what innovative strategies have you all seen survivors take to challenge these oppressive systems in their communities? And what can other movements learn from these strategies?
Well, what we do, or what I'm always part of, is like putting our bodies on the line. Like I said, that I performed as Lady Justice outside. My body was the one that was fought and removed by the police and beaten by the police and fighting me, because my body is on the line anyway as a Black woman, and the forefront before anybody sees is my body and my being and my Blackness. So we've been putting our bodies on the line. And I remember there was one year where the level of gender-based violence has been so high in this country, where we had to organize a shutdown, the whole country to shut down. So we marched to Pretoria, to the union buildings. And when we got there, we wanted to see the president, but instead they fought us. And the police were putting rubber bullets and fighting against, but the women, it was mainly women who took over the country on that day. And we fought back, and we said, we're coming in here, we're going to sit here until the president arrives, whether they beat us, whether they move us. So collectiveness and coming together, whether you're still in the US and somebody is in Ghana and somebody is in India fighting for Coca-Cola, who's stealing their water and the land, it's still the same fight. And we know that through that, and there's somebody in Egypt who's fighting the same fight. We collective, and it fuels us and pushed us, and it keeps pushing us. So the using of our bodies, the collectiveness of groups coming together and using different techniques and methods and methodologies, like I use theater of the oppressed, because it also helps to work with the mind, because sometimes we feel that we are oppressed even when we're not oppressed, and we don't know how to take an action. So a plan of action is always important. I used to do a lot with an organization I used to be with, which will always be part of, called 1 in 9 campaign, where we use a lot of actions, and I do a lot of street theater and other stuff, whatever that we can, to put pressure on the government. So we have a lot of different tools here we've been using at home. I think apartheid also forced us to use a lot of things, and so we're continuing into that. And I think we can always learn from each other as groups here
Absolutely.
coming together to collectively
Celeste, do
exchange.
you
And
have anything you want to share?
Yeah. So again, I'm no expert, right? So we as an organization are on a journey to learn about some of the innovative strategies. So I'll share with you some of what I heard from folks on the ground. And some of what we saw. So one of the first things is that when Me Too went viral, I think it was blocked in China. And so they use the Me Too hashtag. So they use these two emojis that meant Me Too. I feel like one is a pig. I forgot what the other one is. To organize around Me Too in a subversive way. So I think that's big, right? To subversively figure out how to tell stories online through something as simple as emojis is pretty rad. And then that just leads to other folks using WhatsApp and using WhatsApp to stay connected to each other by region. Something else that I thought was really interesting was cloaking classes around body defense and political education around sexual violence and literacy class. And then some of the stories that we heard about in India are women-led patrols. So groups of women that will put their bodies on the line and knock on the door of the rapist and demand that there's accountability, right? And so the fierceness of that I find is innovative. And then there's this started an all-women healing village where victims of abuse and sexual violence and their children can come and live in the village for free. A lot of them are artisans and they're living from their art as a way of having collective healing spaces. So we're seeing this blend of technology, right? And technology being able to connect people, not just in there's this one group, I forgot what they were called, but they started in their neighborhood essentially, and then started organizing neighborhood by neighborhood via WhatsApp groups. And so now they are I think it's a whole part of West Africa. And Me Too Ethiopia is organizing using that way. So we have this technology piece. We have women putting bodies on the line and holding and creating their own accountability structures and trials where there isn't any. And then we have these healing spaces. And then the last innovative technology that I want to speak to is this group that holds classes for men to retrain men. A lot of times the onus of ending sexual violence is on the survivor, right? And it's on women. And so retrain men around how they're thinking about sexual violence, how they're thinking about patriarchy, and having men be responsible for training other men around that to really shift the way the whole village is thinking about it. So those are some of the ways. And I'd love to hear from Lisa.
I know that you with the Global Fund for Women You all directly provide funds for survivors and survivor-led organizations. So are there any innovative strategies that you've seen come out of the funding that you have provided?
Yes, there's so many. I can just a few of them. There's a number of women's organizations, feminist organizations globally who are in countries in post-conflict. And they've created alternative spaces for healing and justice and truth for women who are survivors of conflict, of sexual violence during the conflict. One of our partners in Guatemala, for example, created a tribunal of conscience for past and present sexual violence. And though it didn't have any legal repercussions, it provided a space for the survivors of sexual violence to be heard and to know that their story mattered, and to have a condemnation of the wrong that was done against them. And one of the tribunals also included a survey on racism and sexual violence against Indigenous women in Guatemala, and they brought that information forward in studies that they delivered to many different to government and civil society organization, and they delivered a sentence that had recommendations and a condemnation of this structural violence and racism against Indigenous women. And in terms of some of the patriarchy that then perpetuates sexual violence, there have been a lot of feminist organizations that have worked towards feminist interpretations of religion, particularly around freedom from violence, and others that have really worked with, sought allies within different cultural and traditional institutions and religious institutions. One example of an organization in Mali that sat down with someone with legal expertise, someone from a religious scholar, and someone from a cultural, a traditional healer, to really document women's rights as they're enshrined in the different cultural practices and religious practices. And then they set up these human rights tribunals where they shared these documents, and they had religious leaders and cultural leaders come and present. I think one really, maybe the last one there's two others that I would share about. There's been more and more of our partners have been creating retreat spaces specifically for women human rights defenders, because we know how those who are speaking truth to power and speaking out against sexual and gender-based violence are often then facing violence for their activism. And so we have a partner in Mesoamerica and another one in Africa that's created a retreat space for women human rights defenders, where they're really looking at what does healing justice mean from an Afrocentric perspective, from a Mesoamerican and including Indigenous perspective, and then creating these spaces for collective and self-care and healing. And there's a lot of really powerful movement work on the ground. I think one that was successful in recent years was in Lebanon, where there were these laws that essentially allow a rapist, if someone rapes you and then marries you, that they have impunity. They don't get held accountable for the rape. And so there was a whole movement where they were doing street performances, feminist movements were doing street performances where they had wedding dresses with blood on them, and to really just make it through a visual statement to understand the connection between the violence that was being perpetrated against oftentimes young women forced to marry their rapists. And the law was changed, so it really had an impact in the end.
So we're talking about movement work, and we're talking about these new innovative strategies that people are using while they're doing this work. But sometimes people don't see the impact of these strategies when it comes to dismantling rape culture. So my question for you all is, what advice do you have for survivors and survivor advocates across the world who are having trouble seeing the impact of their work in this movement? Because oftentimes when we don't see progress, we get discouraged. So what advice do you have for people who are having trouble seeing that impact?
I think you're going, Celeste? Oh, I wanted to say, okay. I wanted to say that for me, looking how the widespread of sexual violence and gender-based violence and just all kind of violence directed to women and children and trans and the LGBT community, it's deepening, and it's like as survivors and as women, I would say that right now we have no choice or no other means except doing something and getting involved, because it seems like we need to save ourselves and nobody's here to save us. And just today, I guess everybody who's here and who's part of this conversation, I'm sure they're just as upset with what you mentioned earlier with the Bill Cosby, that shows that us again, that the laws are made by men. When we go with survivors and the young women, especially in court, after they've been raped, who do they find? A man is a judge, a magistrate is a man who is so insensitive and don't even care. And how do we then, as survivors collectively, start addressing like issues, genuinely the issues that we face? I know, Lisa, you spoke about freedom from violence, but what is freedom from violence? What does freedom from violence mean for a Black woman who's in a one-room shack stuck with an abusive man with no economic freedom? And you can't even run when he beats you up to the neighbor because the corona regulation, you're on level 4. So what happens? I just think it's just, it's very hard, but encourage each other for these platforms, I guess, to say that let's find platforms that we as survivors or women who need healings can be safe for us and that are there, right. But also like encouraging each other to say that we need debriefing and healing. Like this kind of series that have been happening, it's just been so powerful because even as somebody who's not a participant, but just listening what it does for you, and when it takes you just listening to those conversations and people coming with sparking different solutions for you and in your head. And I think we should continue igniting each other's light, whether using music or art or data, and collaboratively coming together. And I just think that survivors also finding their own voices and building from that, but with groups also to find solidarity within and speak fairly about the issues and find commonalities of not just being on your own, and know that there are others who you can tap to. And thank you.
Yeah, because a lot of times with this movement, we don't always get the results that we want. And a lot of things can be discouraging, especially after the events that transpired today. So making sure that we continue this work, make sure that we recognize that this is not a setback for the movement and the work that has already been done, the work that has been done for years, for decades, for centuries, and making sure that we continue to give each other that platform. We continue to make sure that survivors feel empowered, inspired, and supported when they come forward about their stories, and just letting them know they're not alone, they're believed, and this movement is for them. And all this is a hard, difficult process to go through, that there can be some sense of healing, some sense of hope, some sense of justice at the end of this process. Celeste, I know that you had something to say about movement work and what you think about the impact of this work and people that get discouraged.
Yeah, I think when we think of movement work, right? I would love if there was just one shot like David and Goliath and we could just knock all oppression out, right? But this
Mm-hmm.
oppression was not built in a day. It was built systematically over time, right? It's
Absolutely.
rooted in so many things, rooted
Yes.
in the idea of women being less than, it's rooted in anti-Blackness, so many things, right? And so when we think about all of the ways that all of the steps it took to get to this problem, we just have to keep that in mind to know that the movement to end sexual violence, the movement to end violence against Black bodies, all of those are protracted struggles, meaning that they're going to be over a longer period of time. And those protracted struggles are on of quite a few levels, right? So we talked
Mm-hmm.
about like values, patriarchy, ways that we see the world. There's systems, right? We have to figure out how to how to change and shift and abolish some of those systems, right? There's the community level of like, what does community accountability look like? How do we shift culture there, right? And then there's the
Mm-hmm.
personal level, right? Of like, how do we shift the idea that it's okay to violate? And how do we take care of those that are violated? So if you're organizing and you feel like, wow, this feels like this is never ending, that's partially the case. But the truth is like, as complicated as this was built, it's gonna take um taking it apart brick by brick. And every time we organize, every time we take action, every time we speak up online, every time we hold someone accountable, even though Cosby was let go today, the fact that he was prosecuted is a big thing. It's a chip at the brick, right? And
Because
we
we
have
don't
to count
oftentimes
those
see that
victories because they were
happening.
not they were not easy victories. So let's count them, right? And then understand that we're committed to a protracted struggle. And then the very last part of that is like being a part of protracted struggle means that we have to take care of ourselves in the process, right? The trauma of dealing with trauma, the trauma of and how that holds in our bodies. And so as organizers, we just have to make sure we keep that in mind so we can continue to chip at the problem.
Absolutely. And as we close this out, I definitely want to get each of your thoughts on our final question, and we can start with Lisa. We are nothing without hope. It supports us in imagining and building toward a future that is not yet visible. So for each of you, what have you seen in the movement that inspires hope for you? What is one thing that you've seen doing this work that inspires you and gives you hope for this movement? And we can start with
I
Lisa.
can go first.
Okay.
Okay. Is it me? Or it's me?
Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
Okay. I was I was gonna say actually a very, 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 very small victory. I was at a Father's Day event with my and everything. And R. Kelly came on the radio and my uncle said, "No to my house." And it was very small, but for my uncle to be who he is, and the debates that we've had, that that very small thing just was like, oh, okay, we shifted some culture, his values and his outlook on this. And so I think that those small moments, which are a result of Black women organizing in their
Mm-hmm.
labor, gives me a lot of hope.
Lisa?
Yeah, I just really resonate with so much of what you all have said, and Celeste with focusing on the little victories and constant self-care. I think one of the first ones that came to my mind in terms of hope was there was a revolution in Chile last year, and women were, as usual, really at the front lines of the revolution. And now they have elected people, constituency of people, of citizens, to rewrite the constitution. And women are going to be half of those that are part of that committee. And so, so many times we see the revolution with women at the front lines, and then their demands are sidelined afterwards, and their role is forgotten. And so this time, I'm hoping that this means that there will be that women's demands will be taken into account into the Constitution.
And last but not least, Thokozani.
For me, what's bringing me hope right now is to see all that is happening in different pockets of the world, all these movements that are there, and just fueling the flames, and just keep the fight. And yeah, as hard as it is for some of the women, wherever they are, but we can see that there is a lot of standing up for themselves. Women are finding their voices. Survivors are coming together to build strength from each other. And that, for me, just brings me so much hope. And just to know that with all this happening, with this pandemic that has come upon us, but we remember to be kind to ourselves, and so we can be kinder to each other and like ignite hope. Most people are losing hope. Yeah, and continue to disrupt, like we're doing, continue to dismantle. I always tell women in the shacks when they say, Thokozani, we call you at 4 a.m., 2 a.m. because the police are not gonna come, but we know you're gonna do something. And I'm like, all the neighbors just go and hit the shack until he stopped beating her up, and then maybe somebody will come save it. But just bringing that kindness and love, just remembering that we're all godly and we all love. Yeah, and just spreading that gives me hope to know that we can still spread so much love and kindness to each other, and wanting healing, and yeah, for everyone.
And for me, what gives me hope is having these spaces and having these important conversations where we can talk honestly and openly about dismantling rape culture. So I would like to thank all three of you for giving your expertise, for joining us in this space, and for your work that you do to dismantle sexual violence globally. Your work does not go unnoticed, and it is greatly appreciated. This series was truly the effort of an entire community. As I thank folks, I invite you to come on camera so we can thank you for your contributions to tonight, as well as the entire Survivor Healing series. So Thokozani, Celeste, and Lisa, again, thank you all for your expertise and your work in this movement. Our audience, the Survivor Healing community, Bria and Angelique for ASL interpretation, Kate Miller and Letty Fox for live captioning support, Melina and Claudio for Spanish interpretation, Iram and Irisha for healing chat support, Shashina for grounding, and last but not least, Samyuktha, who has handled all of our tech. You can find all the episodes in this series on the Me Too Movement YouTube channel. We will also be sharing out the workbook in the end of the series survey to get your feedback on these sessions. Your responses will help us continue to build thoughtful and responsive programming that meets the needs of our community. We thank you again for being a part of the Survivor Healing series. Until next time, stay tuned, and thank you so much for tuning in.